Well, welcome everybody. My name is Ala McCoy. I'm Director of Startup Support at University of Maryland's Ventures. This workshop was organized in partnership with Advanced Program at the University of Maryland and the program's director, Linda Steiner. And for today's discussion, we invited a fantastic panel to talk about what it means to be an entrepreneur. Whether you're interested in launching a large, high-tech, high-growth startup or a small lifestyle company, whether you're in the sciences or the humanities, or if you represent a professional field or research discipline. Our panelists have very diverse backgrounds to present different perspectives. So please welcome our moderator, Julie Lenzer. So Julie is a recovering, as she likes to say, serial entrepreneur. She's a Chief Innovation Officer at the University of Maryland and also has been a public servant. Our speakers today are Dr. Rita Colwell. She is a University of Maryland Distinguished University Professor, one of our most prolific inventors at the university with many patents to her name. She's also an entrepreneur. She's a founder and chairman of CosmosID, a bioinformatics company. We also have Laura Neuman. Laura is an entrepreneur in residence at the University of Maryland, a serial entrepreneur, high-tech entrepreneur, and also a partner at NextGen Venture Partners. And sorry about that. We also have Tejaswini Kale, who is a scientist by training and is an owner of a small consulting company called VOM Consulting LLC. So as you can see, we have a very diverse set of panelists with great backgrounds. And you will be able to ask questions as well. Please submit them via the Q&A function. And if somebody else submitted a question that you like, go ahead and vote on that, and we will ask that question first, and I will be watching that. So, and as Linda mentioned, this is hopefully one of the first in a series of workshops that we are hoping to prepare specifically for audience who are part of the advanced program and maybe some of the others that are interested. And Linda will follow up with a questionnaire about further interest. So again, thank you so much. Without further ado, Julie, why don't you go ahead and take the stage?
Thank you so much, Ala. And Ala didn't really introduce herself, so I'd love to give her some props. She is the Director of Startup Support for the University of Maryland. She has done an amazing job, helped, I would say, probably hundreds of entrepreneurs in the sciences, in research to get started and launch their businesses and sometimes to realize maybe the business isn't for them. And so I just want to do a shout out to Ala. She's tireless in her pursuit of helping entrepreneurs. So thank you, Ala.
Thank you, Julie.
And I am so excited to be here with these three women. Just so many things that we can talk about. I'm going to probably get it started with some questions. And ladies, if I ask a general question and you'd like to answer, you can just unmute yourself and then I will know. And I really do encourage you all to submit your questions because we want you to get out of this session what you need out of it. So we'll be watching the Q&A. Please don't be shy. I don't think any of these ladies are shy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them, I'd like for them, Ala gave you a brief background, and I would maybe just like each of you to talk about your entrepreneurial experience. And Laura, since you are unmuted, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Just talk about your incredible career at Matrix. You have such an amazing story, and I think the folks are just going to be thrilled to hear it. Can you start us off?
Well, you're very kind, Julie. I appreciate that. And it's been a real joy and an honor to work with you over the years. Julie is her own successful entrepreneur in her own right. So she would very easily be able to contribute as a panelist as well. For me, my journey to entrepreneurship was not intended. By the way, I have a cold, just to let you know. If you can't understand me, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try and do a better job. My children came home for Thanksgiving and left me with a cold. So I'm sure I'm not the only one. But my journey to entrepreneurship was really about creating opportunity. If you're not familiar with my background, it really started in a very challenging way. I grew up in a struggling environment in a family where opportunity and education weren't part of the conversation. And so my parents didn't finish high school, and they both have pretty questionable backgrounds and records. And so for me, growing up in that environment in Baltimore City, I didn't know what opportunity looked like. I didn't understand that you went to college and then you went to a good company and you got on a management training track, and that was really the start of your career. I didn't have a preconceived idea of what a career should look like. Instead, what I had was a burning desire to get out of my circumstances and do something in the world. And that's kind of how I ended up just accidentally in business. I'd been waiting tables and working in retail and the jobs that we used to pay the bills when we're young. And I replied to a help wanted ad for a company called T. Rowe Price right here in Maryland, and I became a customer service rep. Now, at that point, I am a high school dropout, just like my parents, and I couldn't afford to go to college. So I didn't really have a path in a T. Rowe Price or an IBM or a Microsoft because they have a traditional approach to how they want to hire, and I didn't fit their traditional check the boxes approach. So as I worked my way through my 20s, I was like, I love business. This feels like a good fit for me, but what do I do with this? How do I work my way into opportunity? And what I realized is that the entrepreneurial path was more about creating opportunity and betting on yourself than it was waiting for someone else to bet on you. I happened to be fortunate in my early 30s to be at a meeting with the recruiter for the MBA program at Loyola. And they encouraged me to apply, and I ended up getting a master's degree in business without ever going back to college or finishing high school. But that's not typically how it's done. What that did give me is a chance to check that education box, which gave me credibility with future venture capitalists when I decided to start my own company. So entrepreneurs we're rabble rousers, right? We go out and we make things happen and we challenge the status quo. But you've also got to check the boxes as well, because you want to have credibility when you're trying to raise money. So for me, I turned that into taking a lot of risk. And one of the companies, the one Julie mentioned, I went into when they literally were insolvent and could not pay their bills. They couldn't pay for their patent filings. And I turned it around, raised 17 million in venture capital, hired a great team, and the company was very successful. But the truth is, and this is very important, I took a lot of risk. I jumped off the cliff. So I cashed in all my savings, I cashed in my 401k, and I paid my bills on a credit card to go and become CEO of that company. And inherently, that risk is required if you want the big reward. For me, I was fortunate the company was eventually sold for $230 million. So it was a great ride, but there's certainly an element of believing in yourself that's required along the way. And of course, I had the honor of serving in public office and being a public servant myself too. So it was a wonderful experience, but certainly it's a roller coaster ride too.
That's a great way to describe it. And I suspect that Dr. Colwell, your experience is probably a little bit different because you have been in academia for a fair amount of time. Would love for you, and also in public service. I think that's one of the things many of us have in common. You were the head of the NSF, I believe, for a few years, yes? So would love to hear kind of how you have this incredibly successful academic career and have time and inclination to work in a business on the side and be an entrepreneur. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Laura, that was a fantastic story. I think it's truly wonderful, and it's an honor to be on the panel with you. My background isn't all that different in the sense that my parents were immigrants, but they had a strong belief in education, and therefore for them it was really critical that we go through high school and go to college. And as a result, my parents, neither of whom went to college. My father was interesting story. The only way in Italy that he could be educated was to go to a seminary to become a priest. And when it came time to be ordained, just a minute, sorry about that. When it came time for him to be ordained, he took the first boat to the U.S. my mother followed him soon thereafter. Growing up, I've written the story in a book. It was published by Simon & Schuster last year. The title, A Lab of One's Own, a woman's journey through sexism in science. So being a scientist, being a woman 40 or 50 years ago was really difficult. Every time you turned around, you had a hurdle to overcome. So it was really perseverance. For example, there was I was accepted at Radcliffe, but I would have had to commute from a little town north of Boston every day. My sister had started teaching at Purdue University, and she suggested that I should apply to Purdue. And I received a complete scholarship, sort of like a football scholarship, books, tuition, etc. So I headed off to Purdue. And I'm really delighted in retrospect because it was the best decision I ever made. It was the top engineering school at the time, and I wanted to do science. Had I gone to Radcliffe, I wouldn't have been able to go to the library because women weren't allowed in Widner Library. I wouldn't have gotten classes with the Harvard students because women were quite separated. Anyway, at Purdue, I majored in science and decided to go to medical school. And my senior year in March, graduation was June, I went on a blind date with this really handsome graduate student. And we were married before I graduated. And we were happily married for 62 wonderful years. Jack was a physicist. He passed away 3 years ago. So I went to my department chairman. I'd been accepted to medical school. In fact, I'd been accepted to all three that I applied to. I was off on my way to Yale Medical School. Jack and I decided that he didn't want to lose the 1 year that he had put in grad school, because he had been in the Army and come back and was a grad student. So we decided that we would both do a master's at Purdue and then go on, and I'd do medicine and he would do his PhD in physics. So I went to the department chairman and asked for a fellowship because I knew they had them. They were distributing them. And his response was literally, quote, "We don't waste fellowships on women." So I was pretty upset, went to see my undergraduate advisor, who knew I was an A student. And he said, that's his problem. I happen to have a research assistantship. And if you will take care of the fruit flies, I just got a grant to study genetics of fruit flies, you can do a master's. And so that's how I did the master's in genetics, which was perfectly wonderful at the time. Little did I know that I had fallen into a hugely good opportunity because the structure of DNA had been determined only 5 or 6 years earlier. And here I was doing a master's degree in genetics, which meant that at Purdue, I had to take fruit fly genetics, tomato genetics, chicken genetics, human genetics, bacterial genetics. I was up to here in genetics, which was perfect for the 21st century. So there's a series of stories, one after another. It seems that it never quite ends for women. And in science, it was particularly difficult. However, I started my career as an academic at Georgetown University. My husband took a position at the National Bureau of Standards, which is now NIST, Institute of Standards and Technology. And I was offered a position at Georgetown. So at Georgetown, as a graduate student, I had worked in systematics. In fact, at the University of Washington, where we both ended up, I didn't end up in medical school because I was accepted to the University of Washington Medical School, but they sent me another letter that said, oh dear, you have to be a tax-paying citizen for a year before you can be admitted. But here's an alternative. You can do a PhD in microbiology. Well, I ended up doing a PhD in marine microbiology, which was totally new, probably no more than 5 in the world who studied marine bacteria. And in addition, the university had just gotten its first computer, an IBM 650, which is a computer that's probably now in the Smithsonian. It had less computational power than your Apple Watch, I think, today. But I learned to program in machine language. And so I wrote the first program to identify bacteria using a computer. This was in 1963. That was a long time ago. And at Georgetown, and then subsequently at the University of Maryland, I ended up in informatics, metagenomics, the genetics of bacteria and viruses. And of course, that has put me right at the forefront of the science today. And at the University of Maryland, which I'm very grateful to the university, I was able to do a lot of really interesting research. And I was the first, I founded the Sea Grant College at Maryland. And then when John Toll became president, he asked me to be his provost and vice president of the university system. And then one day in 1998, I received a phone call. When I went into the office, my assistant said, well, the vice president's on the phone. And I said, the vice president of what? She said, the United States. So I quickly took the call, and it was Al Gore asking if I would serve as director of the National Science Foundation. Now, what I'm leading up to is while I was director of NSF, there was 9/11, and it was followed by the anthrax terrorism events. It was fortuitous that I was a microbiologist, a molecular genetics expert, the first to be the director of NSF because they were traditionally male scientists. I was the first woman. And because I had done some work with the intelligence agencies, I ended up, without going into the detail because it's in the book, I ended up chairing an interagency committee that was classified. And we met every Friday for an hour. And we advised the CIA and the FBI on how to track down the perpetrator using genomic sequencing of the anthrax strains that had been sent in powders and had ended up killing about 7 people. We were able to track down the perpetrators, at least the source of the material, because in the sequencing, there were a series of mutations that were quite specific to those strains that were being sent out by the perpetrator. Well, it took us 6 years because this was, in 2000, this was 21 years ago. And this was when we had just the rudiments of sequencing. But it occurred to me that this was going to be revolutionizing microbiology and medicine. And so when I completed my term as director of NSF, I founded a company because I knew the money that I needed, which was about $2 million. Doesn't sound like much, but it was sufficient, coupled with grants that I obtained from Homeland Security. So with about $4 or $5 million total, which I couldn't have gotten from NIH or NSF, but what I needed to start the company, I started the company, CosmosID, which today now is successful, and we'll have a profit this year for the first time in a decade. That should sound familiar to Laura. The moral of the story, I think, is that for women, you have to have perseverance. You have to overcome the slights and the impediments that come up. You find a way around it. Also, I must say that comparing academic life with industry and business is, it's really not, it's apples and oranges, or maybe it's pineapples and apples. It's very, very different.
Yes.
Whole approach, the ethics. For business, profit is the motive. For academia, it's knowledge, discovery. I found that I really am an academic, hence I couldn't really give up being part of the university. And the University of Maryland has been a really, really fine place to be. I've seen it turn into a world-class university over the 20 years that I've been associated with the university. And I think what one has to understand is that founding a company, going into business, is a way of giving back. It's a way of serving society. It's a way of fulfilling, let's say, perhaps a dream or an idea, bringing an idea to completion. But it's very, very different from academia.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, what I chose to do was to select a really competent CEO who is business-minded. And the science that I put together is really very powerful. The people I recruited are extremely good, but I'm a lousy businesswoman. And so it's much better to have, I'm a good scientist, but not a very good businesswoman. So for me, it was much better to build on the outside the business capability and to maintain the scientific connection and direction. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, a very brief overview of how I came to found CosmosID. I'm very proud of CosmosID because it is a company that we can identify pathogens within 24 hours, accurately right down to species and strain.
Wow.
Genes that they carry for antibiotic resistance, for pathogenicity, and for metabolic traits. And we're now in the process of doing a lot of work on COVID-19 because we're able to determine the variants. And we are working with the state of Maryland through the governor's office and the Department of Environment. Dr. Suzanne Dorsey particularly has been very, very collaborative. And we are monitoring wastewater for the COVID, and we've been able to provide early warning system for the presence in a community.
Wow.
About that, if anybody else, but
that's amazing, and absolutely serving society in a different way. And there's a lot to unpack there that I definitely would like to come back to, especially the the team building and recognizing that you don't want to do payroll, you want to do research. Tejaswini, let's hear your story. You're doing some consulting now, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So talk about how you got into that business and how it works with your other side of your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. So these are very inspiring stories, I should say, just to start with. I think it's a really nice opportunity to hear and, be motivated by these really fantastic women here. I come from a different background, I should say. I come from a background where everybody in my family is a scientist, or my mother is a dentist. She's the only non-scientist, I think. That's right. And it was always, something taken for granted in a way that children in the family would go on to pick up science, degrees, you go on to get a PhD, you go on into some sort of a research program at a university or a government lab. And that's the path that's in a way pre-chosen for you. So when I grew up, that was my idea. I have to get a PhD, I have to do this. And at the time when I was picking my subjects in college, let's just say, I realized that everybody around me, this was around the year 2000, the IT boom was happening back in India. Everybody and their friends and everybody was going into computers and IT. And I was like, I really don't think I want to do that. I want to do chemistry. That's really my first love. That's where I find I enjoy my classes. And my parents were very, very supportive. So luckily, in spite of the bigger pressure around saying, what are you doing? You're going into some chemical engineering thing, everybody's doing this. I was like, well, okay, just let me be. So that was my first step of saying, this is not the conventional thing that I think it doesn't fit me. So I went on into chemical engineering. I taught my class at the university, and then decided to go into a PhD program in chemistry. I was at the University of Massachusetts, and I worked on materials for solar cells, because the renewable energy and the chemistry that can go in it was the most fascinating piece of polymers that I had learned until then. And it was really exciting that this was something that I could, get my hands wet in. And during the course of the program, I was fortunate to get a scholarship that helped me take business classes in the School of Business at UMass, and let me, gave me the opportunity to go pitch my idea, my startup, at the Massachusetts small business forums, multiple ones of them. And that was such an experience. That was an eye opener to me, saying, whoa, this is amazing. I can take my PhD project and I can build a company around it. And I can see that solar cell on somebody's roof someday. That is mind blowing. I was like, whoa, this is so cool. And we were runners up because we didn't have a prototype because I was still working on it, but it was such a journey that it was like, yes, this is something that I should definitely look into. Now, what I realized was the core foundation of a company such as that would be its intellectual property. So I just started to get into, when I went to Brookhaven for my postdoc, I started to get into, how do I patent my inventions? How does that work? How does a company form around it? And quickly I realized that rather than only the lab work piece, I was more drawn into the patents, the patent analysis, what goes around it? How do I form a company around this? So from Brookhaven and that little experience with the Office of Technology Transfer over there, I went on to Hopkins, went into another postdoc for a very different, I was still in my head, still following the PhD postdoc, getting into a research program, but realizing along the way, maybe there's a exit coming up somewhere. But I was at Hopkins, and there I had the good fortune of working with my mentor, who allowed me to, again, get into not just the lab, development. I was working on sensors at the time for toxic gases, and get into, again, working with the Hopkins Tech Ventures office to see, the commercialization piece. Think about the commercialization strategy. How would you raise funding around this? What would be the patent strategy for that project and everything? And that, again, that just, it really reiterated to me that that's the path that I really find myself enjoying. But again, there is that, and then there is family, right? I have 2 little children that I really enjoy spending time with, and it's a family, pressure in a way. My parents and my husband have been very supportive, but it's just a standard thought process in the family. You have little kids, you raise little kids, they get onto other things, then you come back to your career, and that's something that didn't really sit well with me. And I thought that I want to still continue my career. That's something that's very intellectually stimulating for me. I don't want to leave that, but I want to also be available and be there when my kids are young. And that's really how I got into consulting, saying I want to have the time with the family, but I also want to have time for myself and for my intellectual creativity. So I have been consulting with a venture firm here, which incubates and spins out biotech companies. I am, even though I'm a consultant, I am the in-house patent agent at this little company. And I do their patent diligence, prosecution with multiple different law firms across, across the world, really. In pharma, it's a very fascinating field. I'm currently looking at their Alzheimer's pipeline, and it's just amazing. And what being a consultant and a small business owner gives me the flexibility for working with multiple clients. So it's really, looking at many different technologies, from agriculture to pharma to animal health. Hopefully someday going back to renewable energy, but the patent process, the prosecution, the building of your asset, and building a business and raising funds around it is just something that's fascinating. And I think this really gives me the avenue to pursue that passion.
That's awesome. Yeah, from solar cells to law school, it sounds like.
Well, so being a patent agent is not a full.
Oh, okay. So you're just a got it.
I'm
not
a patent
just.
agent, yes.
Yeah, no, but that's incredible. It's a different part of your brain, I think, in some ways. So
I think so, yes.
that is fascinating. And interesting, you mentioned commercialization. And one of the things that we've started to do at the University of Maryland and UM Ventures is kind of go away from that word, because so many times it seems to be a trigger point for scientists and for researchers that commercialization sounds commercial. And it really isn't necessarily.
No.
It's about translating your knowledge and your research into impact.
That's
right?
how I meant it, yes.
No, I'm just bringing that up for other folks, because some people might be watching and say, I don't want to be commercial, if you will, but I'm not hearing anything, around that. But to be honest with you, it is easier to change the world with money, right? I mean, Dr. Colwell, you needed money to start your business. Laura, you picked up into a company that had nothing. And it was scientists, right? I believe it was a technology out of, was it Johns Hopkins or?
NSA.
NSA.
Yes, it was fun to listen to those stories, because in my case, my founders were both scientists and I was the business part of the equation. And so when we started to raise money and I was bringing potential investors through, I didn't even give it a thought. It just came out of my mouth one day when I introduced the two founders, both scientists from NSA. And I said, these are the guys, these guys are the reason that we're here, because none of it happens without a great idea, right? And so it just, I didn't really give it any thought. I was like, these guys are the reason we're here. And without blinking, one of the founders said, and Laura's the reason we're still here. And so we had never had that conversation, but the truth is that you need both. So I loved hearing the different perspectives. It was really great.
I'm curious, Laura, then your observations of how big of a transition was it for your scientific founders when you came in?
Which one?
Pick one.
Well, I'm just going to be honest. I'm just going to be honest and tell you that there were three founders. And it is a cautionary tale. So that's why I'm going to be so candid about it. One of the founders really didn't understand technology. He happened to be in the room at the right time. And there was concern that he could credibly make a claim on the company. So he was made a co-founder. But he didn't really know how to use a computer and didn't have the skills to meaningfully contribute to the company. And so the two other founders before I came in very generously made him an equal co-founder. So he did very well in the end, but he wasn't really on the operations team. That's a really important lesson, because not everyone is ultimately a contributor, and you have to figure that out early on and document those relationships. But the more difficult story, it's always difficult to not bring someone onto the team or to let someone go. It's not a great position to be in. But the other two founders were critical to the success of the organization. And one of them, really was 100% on board. He was the more senior one. And he and I are great friends to this day. And we'll always be great friends. I adore him. I love him. But he recognized what I had to offer, and I recognized what he had to offer. The other co-founder, not so much. Like, I'll just be honest with you and tell you, we came to blows one day sitting around a conference room table because while they needed me and they didn't have any other plans or a game in town, they'd already been through a prior management team. It finally came out. He said, I just can't work for a woman. And sometimes you have to know when to walk away. And I'll never forget, I just pushed my chair out from the table and I got up and I walked out the door. And so I left because you can't work with someone who doesn't want to work with you and can't work for you simply based on your gender. And so, there are a lot of women on this call. We've seen these things. I'm not telling an unusual story here. But I had to let it go. So as much as I wanted to do this, I had to, there's a point at which you have to know when to walk away. Well, they came and got me and brought me back and said, we need your help. We need you to run this company. But he was never okay with my role versus his role. And, look, I still would have done it. I had a lot to prove. I had a lot on the line. I needed to bet on myself and prove I could do this. And I had to accept that these were not perfect circumstances. And to this day, it's a strange relationship. He wanted to be the CEO. He did not want someone else to come in and run this company that he had started. And so that created a lot of strife between us. And, that's just, startups are imperfect places. We all have our own history, foibles, personalities, strengths, and weaknesses. And so you have to recognize that as you come together. It's just not a perfect process. But, at the end of the day, we were successful. He went on to start his own company after that again. And, they called me again and said, will you come and run this company? But he didn't want to give up control. And ultimately, that company is still not off the ground, even though they have great technology. You have to recognize what each other has to offer. And you've got to have respect for that and find a way to work together.
Yeah, thank you. That is such an important message. And oftentimes what I will, tell scientists who, some scientists and some researchers do have a business sense. They have a varied background. So it's not that there is no such thing as a scientist who can't be the CEO, but oftentimes, I will say to them, would you rather be the CEO of a, $1 million company or the CTO of $100 million company, right? There's looking at the bigger picture, like what are you trying to achieve? So Rita, I'm curious, how did you find your CEO, and have you only had one or have you gone through a couple?
You're on mute.
Sorry, that's
okay.
the Zoom call. Mute you on mute.
It's not a Zoom call till somebody speaks on mute.
That's right. I loved Linda's story because I have not exactly, but I have a similar tale in that I've gone through a lot of CEOs. Men have a tendency to inflate their abilities hugely. Women tend to deflate their abilities and be very shy about really recognizing that they have a lot of talent. This is a kind of a generalization. And so I've gone through 3 or 4 CEOs who almost killed the company. But the people whom I hired as the scientists, whom I knew, and engineers and mathematicians and the technical talent are still with the company. This is 10 years later. And they contribute significantly. They make a big difference. But the business side has gone through probably 3 upheavals, simply because the men who I hired, I have learned now how to vet and how to do your due diligence, but I didn't in the beginning. And so these guys came in full of bravado and pomp and bravado particularly, that I've now come to recognize and I can quietly discard. But it's very difficult to learn for a scientist to learn the business side. And I really would recommend the MTech at Maryland, which when I was vice president of the University of Maryland and provost, I helped get started. But when I was starting my company, MTech was really just starting itself and it wasn't that helpful. But now I think it is helpful. And now I strongly recommend that any woman or anyone interested at the university in spinning out a company learn some business. And you don't have to get an MBA, but you do have to know how to read a spreadsheet. And you do have to know the difference between a common stock and a preferred stock, which I didn't know anything about. So there are simple basics, and I think it's important that I would strongly recommend that someone who has a technical background, great idea, wants to start a company, learn a little bit about the business.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You don't want to go in completely, not understanding business at all. And I just want to plug our Entrepreneur in Residence program at the University of Maryland. Laura, as Ala mentioned, is an EIR. So if she and others, you can come and meet with her for free. And, we pay her on behalf of the university to help you to talk about potentially like, what should I look for in a CEO? What should I, what types of programs at University of Maryland? We have over 60 programs for innovation and entrepreneurship. It's incredible. And if you're curious about what they are, you can go to innovate.umd.edu. It's our innovation gateway, and find all the resources. But these webinars that Ala and her team organize are a great way too, and the recordings of them to talk about, what is the difference between preferred and shares, and you don't have to become an expert in fundraising, but you do know how to answer the questions, because I suspect, Laura, that you didn't get any salary when you started, you got equity. And that's a big difference. You need to know how to negotiate those kinds of things.
That is true. And I negotiated a lot of equity because there was no salary.
And that's sometimes what you have to do.
It's not easy to have those conversations. There's no question about it. And I'm glad you brought up, Julie, about, some founders who are scientists or technical founders can also be the CEO. I mean, look, we always hear those stories. Bill Gates is a great example. And I hear Bill Gates literally in almost every conversation with a technical founder who wants to also be the CEO. It does happen. It can be done. It's also quite rare. So, look, I would not be the CTO. So we all have to recognize that we have something to contribute. And the truth is, even if you can do it, let's just say you're a technical founder who can also handle the business side. There's strength in numbers. So bringing more brain power into the organization and having that partnership really leads to a better outcome. And I'm going to give you a great example of that. On my technical team, I had the founders initially, and really incredibly talented guys, both of them, different skill sets, both very complementary and with a lot of depth. But, I have this belief that if you always hire the same thing, you always get the same result. So this business was RFID, radio frequency identification, and it was an underperforming segment at the time. It just wasn't an interesting industry. There were not high valuations or successful exits. So, the traditional or conventional thinking in a business is to hire people with domain expertise. Well, we hired some of those people, and we had some of those people in the founders, but I also hired people who knew nothing about the industry, had zero experience specifically in that industry, but were really smart and had depth in other areas. And one of the first things I did, because you need to have milestones when you're building a company. You need to have things to celebrate and rally around. So I took the first chip design, which was pretty big, and I had it framed and put it up on the wall. That's the chip design that we had patented and was really the start of the company. But after hiring these other smart people who didn't really know our industry, and having the exchange between the people who knew the industry and the people who didn't, all really bright, talented folks, coming together and asking different questions and challenging assumptions about the technology, we actually came to a new outcome. So one of these hires asked a question that had never been considered by the founders, and that led to a new chip design. And truthfully, that chip design is what became our product. And that would have never happened had we not thought unconventionally about how to put the team together. To this day, that very technology is being used and is in the market. So that subsequent second chip design became the standard, it became the product. That company was acquired by Symbol, which was then acquired by Motorola. If you were looking for passive RFID today, you could find that chip design. That first chip design might still be on the wall somewhere. So I just want to share that.
Laura, you're being very humble, but they were early and disruptive and really created the RFID market. And if you don't know what RFID is, you have a toll tag, you know what RFID is.
That's active RFID, yes.
Yeah, so everybody does know that. Tejaswini, you are so speaking of kind of like coming in, you came in from chemistry, which is related to pharmaceuticals somewhat, solar, but you're coming at it from a you're working in totally different area. Talk a little bit about that. You don't have to be this scientific expert necessarily to do the work. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
No, absolutely. It's like Laura mentioned, is everybody has some contribution to make. Everybody doesn't do everything in a startup. Everybody has a very niche, contribution. Me as a chemist in a, pharma company, I'm not the biologist resident. I'm not going to be the one vetting the, the biological data. Is this really working or not? I'm the one who's saying, does the chemistry sound? Does the pattern structure look good or not? So I think that's the first piece is to recognize what is it that I can contribute. The second thing, and I think the really important thing, is because I'm a little outside the field, it gives me a very unbiased view. Mm-hmm. So coming up with, does this really make sense? Would it rather be here than here? That kind of an approach really, I think, brings out sometimes the strength in a product. It's really figuring out how to position it, which is the right place. And sometimes being very technical and very deep into the field really focuses a product down to become very technically sound. But the business application that a scientist may have in mind may not be the best one for that product. And I think it's key in a startup environment to recognize that these two pieces, the technical strength and the business applicability, are both really, really important to make that product, the translation, a success. And I think identifying that is a piece that I contribute very heavily in with my client right now. And that's really a piece that's very, very intellectually stimulating for sure. And it's a critical piece for a startup to me.
And it's different. It's different than what you learned in your PhD.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's very different. I think a PhD and a scientific training really builds the analytical mind for us, is to think logically, what's the next step? What could this be? Business can be a little bit of science, but a little bit of art, is to really understand the market space, understand the unmet need and how you can really cater to that need. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking.
It's a completely different way of thinking. And and actually sometimes I've seen scientists who won't make an assertion until something is 100% correct or pretty close to correct. That doesn't always work in business, because you can't always wait till you're 100% certain that something, depending on the field that is. Certainly when you're working with COVID and detection of pathogens, you have to be,
the data always needs to be strong, yes, but the marketing, and I think that's something that even today, to me, it doesn't come naturally. I still feel like a scientist. I want to see all the data before I can make an assertion. But my colleagues tell me, Teju, really, this is good enough to get to the next step. That's still coming along, and that's okay. So that's a business angle for scientists for sure.
Yeah, and certainly the diversity on teams and everything drives more innovation, as we were speaking about earlier. But to the one of the questions in the Q&A, asking about how do you become, if you don't have a science technology background. Laura, you did get an MBA. I have an opinion about this, but I'm going to ask you how much your MBA, how much you felt it helped you with your entrepreneurial endeavor.
I was the most qualified, I was the most unqualified, least qualified person on the planet to become an entrepreneur or the CEO of a company. And I'm not being modest when I say that. Look, I do think that becoming a successful entrepreneur is about a combination of, wanting to create something and build something and not giving up, but also checking certain boxes. And so I'm really fortunate that I was able to get the MBA. And I got a lot out of that experience, and I'm grateful for Loyola taking a chance on me. But the truth is, all that did was give me credibility. Being an entrepreneur is inside of you. And you either feel that drive or you don't. Because I can tell you right now, I was out at Stanford Business School for the executive program for the summer when I closed my Series A, and I was with 143 other people. Out of those 144, by the way, only 19 were women, leaders, business leaders from all over the world. And when I closed the Series A, one of my colleagues in the program was the CEO of Shandong at the time. And so I bought a case of sparkling wine to celebrate the big occasion, and I shared it with all of my classmates. I can't tell you how many people came up to me afterwards. And these are people who work at big companies all over the world. They're country managers for major shipping companies, and came up to me and said, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I was like, all right, well, mortgage your house, put it all on the line, cash out your savings in your retirement account, and then come talk to me, right? No, I'm just kidding when I say that, but it's actually kind of true. You have to be willing to take that kind of risk. You have to be willing to bet on yourself. That's not an easy thing to do, especially when you're in a larger company with a secure job. So I do think at the end of the day, that's either in you, that drive is in you, or it's not. But speaking to the technical versus non-technical, I am not a scientist. I only know enough to be dangerous on any company that I interact with. Julie probably has a lot more depth than I do in the science on any of these companies.
You ask great questions though, Laura.
Because I don't have that background.
But
right?
I think that's part of it, being curious. You're smart enough to be curious and ask questions and not worry if you look, if it might be a stupid question to the scientist, and you uncover. I think that's part of your magic, actually.
Well, you're very kind to say that. I actually love that I don't have the background, because I am curious, and and if you can explain it to me and I can get excited about it, it's probably an interesting idea. So I don't think it's a requirement. I think that successful entrepreneurship, company building requires a lot of different experiences and skill sets. And at the end of the day, you've all got to be behind that mission together.
Let me speak from the side of the scientist. The same kind of enthusiasm, interest, commitment to science is what I felt, and I could have, sure, if I had dropped everything at the university and just completely focused on business, I could have done it, because in fact, my very first time being involved with the business was I was asked to be on the board of a $300 million biotech company, Life Technologies. And I asked the CEO if he would mind sending me for a week or two to Harvard Business School so that I could learn what a good member of the board would be. And he said, of course. So I did do that. And it was very interesting. And I did make a lot of connections. But my heart and soul really is in science, because the work that I'm doing, even now on predicting COVID using models and doing a combination of molecular genetics combined with computational calculation of risk based on the work on cholera that I'd done for 40 years. I wasn't really ready to give up the science for the business, but I wanted the business to work. And I wanted to make sure the scientific side of it was strong, which it is. I mean, that's really, as I said earlier, the team I put together scientifically is still there. So I think it's a choice that you personally have to make if you are able to have that choice, whether to be the scientist or to be the business person that runs the business, or to be the individual who just throws everything into it. And if you're really keenly interested in science and engineering or math or whatever, or perhaps even the social sciences, and you're not ready to give it up, then there's still a way to be the entrepreneur and to be involved and to be guiding and have the satisfaction without essentially mortgaging your soul.
Right. And in fact, that's part of what Ventures we do is matching scientists or founders, technical founders, researchers with potential team members, CEOs, or because to be honest, the company probably needs you to continue in your research to develop new products and new ideas. And so, but Dr. Colwell, you also mentioned earlier persistence and perseverance. I think those traits that make a good researcher are also really helpful in entrepreneurship, for sure.
You have to be really stubborn. If you know what you are doing and the path that you're taking is accurate and is new. I've made several discoveries that have challenged the status quo, and it's not easy. You get really very, very disconcerting attacks and on your person, on your reputation, etc. But you just persevere, and I've never had to retract a single thing. Touch wood.
That's great. Yeah, going against the grain is definitely something that entrepreneurs don't shy away from. And I'm going to talk we have another question in the Q&A, but I want to kind of follow this thread a little bit into the idea of failing, because we're talking about risk, we're talking about being stubborn and persevering. Can you share a time when maybe something that you tried or an idea that you had didn't work out? Because I think so many people think that they look at folks like you and how successful you are, and they don't realize that there's probably several false starts or wrong paths or failures on your path that you, and how did you deal with that? Anybody can start.
Well, I think the failure in choosing a lousy CEO from the get-go, that created lots of problems. But it was a learning experience, lesson learned. And it applies in science now. I don't take anything for granted. I do my due diligence.
Excellent. Laura?
How much time do you have? Sure. I mean, look, you can't succeed as an entrepreneur without having a few stumbles along the way. And there's this classic saying about entrepreneurs: you don't know what you don't know. And so that's a process. I will share with you quickly my epic failure story, because I do think it's very illustrative. Right before the company we're talking about, Matrix, was another company that I started. I had come off this great run with an internet company in DC. I closed, or either I or someone on my team closed every deal that was on the S1 as they filed for an IPO. That was a huge success. And that was great, but I was cut out of the IPO at the last minute. And that was a problem for me. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I decided that I was going to go, one of my colleagues at that company said, let's go start a company. And I'm like, okay, if I'm going to work this hard, I want the upside. So we started a company together. And at the time, it was right after the deregulation of the big bells, the telephone companies. There was the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it was 1999. And companies were starting to pop up across the country that were becoming competitors for delivering streaming internet connectivity to homes and businesses. And I was like, of course, video is going to be streamed in the future. I mean, that was long before this actually happened, but I believed that that was going to be the future. So that's what we did. We started this company that was going to be a huge infrastructure company to make streaming data available. And it was a big idea, but we brought big people into the plan. We hired the top lawyer in the space. We went to the top venture capitalists. I ended up raising $95 billion in financing to launch this company. not only did I not know how to raise venture capital, I went and looked for a seminar on how to do it. I knew nothing about it. So I went to a seminar called How to Raise Venture Capital. And I know it sounds so simple, but it's so true. And I went up to each of the presenters afterwards and said, can I present my business plan to you? I'd really like to meet with you. And shockingly, they both said yes. Now, I did show up looking credible. I put on a suit and I was dressed for the occasion, and I wanted them to think of me as a serious potential investment. But I couldn't believe how willing they were to talk and to meet. And then I was like, oh no, now I've got to, I actually used an expletive and said, oh my gosh, I've got to write a business plan. Like, I wasn't even prepared for them to say yes. I just thought for sure they would say no. But what you'll find in the world of entrepreneurs is that they're very friendly and collaborative and helpful. So I went into these meetings and I met with these guys, and they were like, yeah, interesting idea. And that's what's so shocking, is that you think that you have to have it perfect, and you don't. What you need is a good idea and a really great team of people. So it's even better if you have a great idea and a great team, but a good idea and a great team is a requirement. So, as it turned out, we got moved from, worked our way up the food chain of venture capital. And at the end, it was like 25 million or 50 million, I can't remember, in venture capital, and the rest was in vendor financing from Cisco. Bottom line is home run. In this case, I recognized that while I was the business person, I needed someone more senior to get this kind of company off the ground. So we went, hired a top firm, recruiting firm, executive search firm, and he brought in the perfect candidate for us to hire as our CEO. Well, after several months, almost a year of, meeting with every venture capitalist who would agree to talk to us and interviewing multiple candidates, we had the perfect guy. And we put an offer on the table to him. And he took our really great offer back to his current employer and negotiated another $7 million in stock and ended up staying where he was. So lesson learned there. I mean, I don't blame him. It wasn't personal. But at the end of the day, it was like, gosh, we're still trying to make this happen. And, it was difficult. And we decided that we were just going to let it go. We had done what we could do. And the reason I share this story is that I invested all of my savings at that point. When I went to Matrix, my savings were pretty much gone. I had to go to the retirement account. But at this point, I've depleted my savings. And, I put several months into it, and it should have gotten off the ground. It should have launched. I mean, we had the best investors at the table. We had a great idea, but you have to know when to walk away. And so I walked away. And so I call that my epic failure story, because I invested in it with time, money, energy, everything I had, but we didn't get it off the ground. But the truth is, had I not done that, I would not have been ready for the next opportunity. The next opportunity is the company I told you about earlier, Matrix, where I went in and they had no money, and they had been through a management team, and they were about to go out of business. So each of their respective wives had said, you have 12 more months and time's up. So they were 11 months into those 12 months, and they were about to call it quits. And stepping into that role and negotiating to run that company, really, I would not have been prepared for what was most essential there in that moment, which was to raise money, had I not been through my epic failure just the year before, in the previous experience. So there is something to be learned in everything that you do. But I really need to convey the impact of that, because had I not done that, I wouldn't have been able to succeed at Matrix, which was next. So I hope that's helpful and clarifying.
Absolutely. As you said, Dr. Colwell, learning from your mistakes. Tejaswini, is there any you want to share?
Yeah, no, around this fundraising, right? There is always the burning need for a startup to stay alive is to raise funding. And there was one idea that we were working on earlier a few years ago. And there was this fantastic research. We put in almost a year of, this is the R&D plan. This is going to be wonderful. Here's how we are doing cost analysis. And this is the market. This is, we did all of that research. We came up with a beautiful business plan, and then realized that there are only 4 serious investors in this field, and 2 of them just recently invested in other companies who would be potential partners. So that brought us down globally to 2 investors. Now, having put in all that effort and, coming up with all that excitement, beautiful plan, this is ready to go, there's no funding, is really heartbreaking. So what we learned is, don't just do your research and build the plan, always think about all the aspects simultaneously. Think about who is going to be, potential investor, what are the grant agencies, just think of all of those. So I feel we are better prepared now for the next ones that we are taking. We are already, learning from those mistakes, already reaching out to investors, figuring out, what are the deals in the space, what's going on, who is there. So just learning as we go.
Yeah, and so, one of the questions in the Q&A, Vanessa asked about credibility in order to get funding and support. That's an interesting, everybody had to start somewhere to raise money, right? And I'm guessing your first company, Laura, you had never done it before. Dr. Colwell, you had to raise $4 to $5 million for your company. I'm guessing that you'd never raised that. I mean, you've certainly done the grants, but venture capital or even angel investments, very different. What did you think was your biggest barrier towards the credibility, or did you just say, Laura, you mentioned that I just put on the suit, I looked the part, I faked it till I made it, and I don't know, what are your thoughts on that credibility question?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I faked it till I made it, but I would say that a variation on that, which is that I'm not a Harvard prodigy, and I knew that. I had to prove myself, and I wasn't afraid to prove myself. And I think that's a really important lesson, because we read about Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, but the truth is that's not the majority of us. We have to prove ourselves. And I'm not uncomfortable doing that. One of the things that I learned is that, and we have this idea of potential investors, wanting to have the perfect idea or candidate to invest in. And the truth is they're just looking for good deals. I mean, they want a good idea and they want a good team. And they'll take a mediocre idea with a great team over a great idea with a mediocre team. And if you think about, this myth that, it's got to be perfect for them to invest, that's actually not true. They're very approachable and they're very willing to look at ideas and invest in people if they believe in the people and they believe in the idea. And what they want to know is, are you credible? Are you going to put everything you have into making this company successful? Are you going to, I've been asked this question, are you going to stare at the ceiling in the middle of the night and think about how to be successful in this company? They want to know that you're in it to win it. And so, that was a surprise to me. I immediately assumed that was going to be a challenge. Now, that said, they want some credibility. They want you to check some boxes. That's always helpful. But the truth is they're really investing in you and what you're all about. So it is the time that I learned in my career that your personal narrative, your personal story, and I have loved hearing the stories from the other women on the panel today, is really where your credibility lies. It's not in whether you got your MBA from Harvard or Loyola or University of Maryland or Princeton. It's in, how did I get there? What did I do? And what was my journey? And if you can share that in a compelling way, that's going to move them. And I know it sounds crazy because it's so personal, but you have to remember at the end of the day, they're investing in people, and that's you.
I should point out that scientists, myself, for example, raise money over our careers. We get grants and contracts. Over my career, I've probably raised $40 or $50 million in research contracts and continue to do so. So it isn't a matter of raising money. It's exactly as Laura says. It's simply demonstrating your competence and your ability to carry out that which you propose to do. So I do think that starting out as a scientist or an engineer or an entrepreneur, an academic entrepreneur, is as good a foundation as any. The tendency, however, is that there's a discounting if you're an academic, that somehow your head is in the sky and you don't have your feet well grounded in the practicalities. But that's not really true. If you've been running a lab, for example, during the heyday of my lab, I may have had 40 or 50 people, students, postdocs, visiting scientists. So I was essentially running the equivalent of a small company as a laboratory at the University of Maryland. So the competency is there. again, it just comes down to whether you want to completely become engrossed entirely in that single endeavor, or if you're trying to bridge the two worlds, in which case you do need a partner, and it has to be a competent partner in the skills that you are not either having yourself or not willing to give up in order to become competent in that area.
Yeah, I think
Right, so I would be very encouraging to women scientists at the University of Maryland who've got a good idea, find out how to get that to work and go for it.
you've got a lot of support around you. And I would say, I know my time, I built and sold a software company 10 years, or no, it was 10 years as I was in the company. But I learned more about myself in those 10 years and what I could do and what I really shouldn't do and what I couldn't do. It was amazing. But that's really interesting to think about. There's credibility and skills that come from a lot of different things. And actually, even I wrote a book, gosh, 14 years ago, something like that. It's not quite the co-authoring of the 19 books and 800 scientific publications that you've had, Dr. Colwell. But it was called The Parentpreneur Edge: What Parenting Teaches About Building a Successful Business. And it talks about the parallels of raising a family and a business. There's interestingly a lot of parallels.
Absolutely.
So you find
because
credibility.
sometimes you feel like you're raising children when you're starting that business.
Exactly. We have another good question. If I want to be an entrepreneur but don't know what type of business to start, how can I find good ideas for businesses? Anybody want to take that one on?
Wow, I've always turned into my head for those ideas.
Tuned into your own head.
Yeah.
Yep.
I will say that I have been a speaker at University of Maryland to the business school and to the engineering school. And I love meeting with the engineering students because they actually have the best questions, the most ideas. They're very engaged. And, look, I'm the business student, so no disrespect to the business students, but I would be spending my time there because I am so impressed with the depth and breadth of experience, ideas, and honestly, downright insight from the students I've interacted with there. So I would look for someone who has a different skill set than I have to offer. If I really wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I wasn't sure how to do it, I'd be looking for a partner who sees the same vision but brings different experience.
Good advice.
Well, I would also say this part of the consulting that I do is to find technologies that could be licensed in. So university tech transfer offices, a plugin for you guys. I think those are really, really helpful. The websites, and I have found in my work that, reaching out to university tech transfer offices, people are very friendly and approachable, and always have wanted to talk to and explore avenues for taking the university technologies forward. So I come from the other side, which will potentially fund it. So in a way that's the way I scout for technologies.
Yeah, and something you should know. I mean, technologies out of the university generally are early stage, and so they're going to require some work, but that's why the team is really important. I also, looking out at your world and the things, looking for problems to solve that people are willing to pay to have you solve. That's a good clue, a good path to follow. Things that irritate you may irritate other people. You can't assume it. And that's why through the University of Maryland, we offer the I-Core program. And it's an incredible program. It's an NSF-based program. I don't know if any of you have been through the I-Core program. You have? You want to talk a little bit about it?
Oh, it was a really good program, I should say, but my most dreadful experience was the requirement of calling 40 people, cold calling, and trying to understand what their pain point is, and then figure out, does my product fit in? But I should say my experience there landed me at a Baltimore County Fire Department. And the fire marshals were very, they were very helpful. And, they let me sit through their training program where they were talking about different gas sensors. I was working on gas sensors back at the time to figure out, the people who actually go answer the 911 calls, and they're using their sensor, figuring out, is this a carbon monoxide issue or is this an acetylene gas issue? And just figuring out what their pain points are and how my technology would fit in there. So iCore program is really, really good.
And really out of your comfort, really out of your comfort zone.
Absolutely.
Intentionally so.
But it really comes out making a strong business case. You'll really figure out where your product sits. Our impression might be, it's really the home market that I was looking at, but it turns out it was the firefighters that really needed it. So that iCore program really helped there.
And sometimes it can help you understand that there isn't a market for what you're trying to do for the price that you can do it for. And I think that's a really
to understand that early on than later.
Dr. Colwell, and how did you do kind of like, have you, you clearly had a lot of connections through your professional career and your time at NSF. So you probably had a ready swath of customers, but have you had to pivot your idea and what you offer based on feedback from customers? Or do you think you just had such a good relationship with them in the beginning that you were able to set it up correctly?
I think one of the advantages that was backhandedly given to me was that starting out as a woman scientist, recognition by my fellow scientists in the US was minimal, but I ended up doing a lot of international work simply because being from the US, it didn't matter so much if you were a man or a woman, a little bit, but not as much. And as a result, I now have collaborations and projects underway in Japan, Singapore, Latin America, students from Europe and the UK. I still collaborate with colleagues in Italy and France, truly global. And it was essentially I had to do it because I was being asked to give talks and to be involved in projects internationally when I wasn't at home. It was really very strange, but I have benefited hugely from it because now we're in a global world, a real global world. And I already have connections that go back 30 or 40 years, former students of former students. So those connections have turned out to be hugely valuable.
That's interesting that you mentioned connection. I would love to pivot to that because networks, they're often one of the things that they say that is one of the reasons that women are so poorly represented among venture capital investments. Would love to hear more about from the other two about your network, or how have you expanded your network or been able to use your network, or in what you're doing. Laura, I know I got one of my jobs because of a network, because I had worked with you. So full disclosure, when Laura was the CEO of Howard County Economic Development, I'd had her come in and teach. We had met actually through Amy Millman at Springboard, and I had her come in and speak to one of my women's entrepreneurship classes. And then when she was looking for an executive director for the Maryland Center for Entrepreneurship, she called me. And so that was a great network connection. And I brought her into the university. So
that's right. We're just going to continue doing this forever, Julie. I really cannot emphasize enough the importance of this subject. And I'm going to be honest, I suck at it. Like, I'm the worst networker you've ever met in your entire life. The guys are masterful at it. I'm sorry for the guys on the call, because I love you too. A lot of guys in my world. I brought one into the world. But please understand that this is one of the most important things that women must learn. We must learn how to network without networking. I personally am not a card collector. I can tell you, just in the last couple of months, here are all the cards that have been handed to me at events, and I haven't even gotten through them. It's not about collecting a card at an event. It's about making a personal connection. And so I have started to like let my guard down and really try to do this because, you know, how I grew up, I was a little cautious and, you know, what does that look like? And how can I be helpful? Do I really have something to offer? Do they want something from me that I can't, and I don't have to offer? And so
Don't
I
talk to
spent,
strangers.
right, you're right. And how hard is it to walk into a room full of strangers and say, hi, nice to meet you, as you walk up to each person in that room? There are very few people who feel comfortable doing that. Let's be honest. Very few. Well, Julie might be one of them. Like, I'm just
You're
gonna
right.
say,
No, yeah.
she should be the president. Look, the truth is that for most of us, we're a little bit shy, even if we're outgoing. Like I'm outgoing, but I'm also shy in a group because, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. And I don't think we talk honestly enough about it. There's just this idea that in business, you must be good at this. And the truth is, I have to tell you, the guys know how to do this. The deals that happen between people. And I have never met a human being that didn't have an interesting story or some way to connect with them. I have never left a conversation with someone where I didn't feel like I had more than I had coming into it. It's always been a great experience to get to know that other person. And we must become better at that. And I have heard Amy Millman talk about this literally for 20 years. But we have to change. We got to shift our thinking about it. It is not about networking. It is not about collecting cards and sending a follow-up email and say, hey, I'm glad we met. It's about making a real, genuine connection. And when you make that connection, what you've done is you've made a friend. And that friend doesn't necessarily have the same experience as you do, or even the same belief system that you do, but they have something to contribute just as you have something to contribute to them. And so if there's one thing you want to learn how to do in the coming year, my New Year's resolution for you is to get comfortable walking into a room, knowing that most of the, assuming Julie's not in the room, everybody else in there feels a little bit uncomfortable too. And just walk up and start talking to someone, and you will find that they are just as nervous as you are, or they've just had a bad day like you had a bad day, or, you know, the babysitter didn't show up one time. These things happen to all of us. And when we recognize that and realize we're all just human, and we make that connection, start talking to someone, chances are you're going to be really glad you did. So
Making that connection though, not just superficially. And I think it goes back to your curiosity, you know, asking questions. If you don't know what to say and you don't like small talk, come up with like a really interesting question, something you legitimately want to learn from somebody else. And people walk away from conversations where they do all the talking thinking, wow, that was a great conversation.
I have said to my children, I have 2 teenage children, and you know, they're around adults a lot. And I said to them, never go into a conversation or a meeting with someone, like you're going to go have dinner with some friends of mine. Go in there prepared with 3 questions to ask. I said, because it's always more interesting when you listen to the other person talk instead of doing the talking. Because there was a time in my career where I was talking because I wanted to be legitimate and taken seriously and feel like I had something to offer. But the truth is, it's a much more interesting conversation when we ask the other person meaningful questions and get to know them. So
let me speak to the personal point. It's fascinating. We've got 3 women. All of us have children. One, you're in the toddler stage. Laura, you're in the teenage stage, and I know I've gone through it. I've raised 2 daughters, and I'm in the adult, I guess, successful adult stage, because one daughter is a physician, and I'm here in Halifax, Canada, where she runs a clinic for a pediatric developmental and palliative care clinic. My other daughter is a botanist who is the curator and a wildflower expert at University of California, Davis. So I want to shout out for the fact that yes, indeed, it isn't that you can have it all. That's not the point. The point is that children, if you wish to have them, you can have them in a career. It's important to have the right partner who will be helpful, but nevertheless, the important issue, I think, is I've in my career, at the time I was starting, a lot of women simply gave up having families because it was either family or career. That's not the case. There are ways of succeeding, and we have 3 examples here, as I say, at each stage of family development. So that's a point I think I should like to emphasize. Those of you who are thinking about entrepreneurship, professional, or even government, my time at NSF was the most delightful, happy, successful time. I almost doubled the budget. I got on very well with Congress and with having learned in the Maryland State Legislature. So there are careers that out there waiting for you, and so is a family.
Yeah, I started my company when my oldest daughter was 6 months old and had another baby a year later. So was it crazy? Absolutely. Did I get most of my work done between the hours of 9 p.m. and 1 a.m.? Absolutely. Yes. Sleep, I used to say I could sleep when I'm dead. So
you guys are stronger than I am. I intentionally did not start a family until after. And the truth is, I don't know if I could have done it. I mean, I just think it's amazing, and I applaud you. But it felt like a lot to do. And I don't think there's such a thing as balance, but there is such a thing as sort of, making it all work out. We can function and do multiple things, but we can't really balance it per se. It's more integration than it is balance.
Yeah,
it's finding how to get the help that you need. I was fortunate in that we had a hire that lived with us as sort of a grandmother for 10 years. Made a huge difference. But there are different ways. It's, my way is not the only way. And it's certainly not the highway.
So, Tejaswini, you've got young ones. Talk to us about that. That's part of the reason you became a consultant, right?
That's right. Because they're all full-time jobs, right? All of this is, and being a mom is 24/7 job. There's no sick leave. You get to work anyways. So I think just striking the balance, or more appropriately, as Laura said, integrating, the two parts of your life in a way, in the best manner that, fits your life stage, is the way to go. Don't stress out. There's pace everything the right way to keep your mental balance. That's what's the key, and once you get that paced out, things will work out because you have the passion to drive.
Well, I just want to tell you that
one of the rewards of grandchildren. I've got those now too.
Now you're just bragging, okay?
I should bring my mom on to this one.
I just want to say that when I was in those early years, I thought that was the hardest time of my entire life. You're so sleep deprived, and it's just so new and so different than your experience in the workforce. But Julie is the one who said to me, buckle up, Buttercup. You haven't seen the teen years. And talk to me then, because those are the hard years. And, so I don't want to scare you or anything, but she was right.
Yeah. But well, this has just been, I feel like we could go on, but we are wow, it's been 90 minutes already. So I just want to tell you ladies what an honor and a privilege it has been to facilitate this conversation and to hear your stories. Just amazing. And I hope that there's something in here that everyone has connected with on one level or another. And we did record this, so please feel free to share it with folks who weren't able to make it. Tune in. There's lots of these workshops where this one came from, and we're thankful to our speakers, and hope to see you again very soon.
Thank
you, ladies.
Thank you. Really, really done well.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you to Julie for yet another wonderfully moderated discussion. And it's just been so personally to me, so inspirational to hear everybody's stories. And I just love the diversity of the backgrounds, yet how it all comes sort of together. This has been fantastic. So I will follow up with a recording once it's posted on Startup UMD YouTube channel. And I also will circulate a sign-up sheet where you can sign up to meet with our entrepreneurs in residence, and Laura is one of them. She's absolutely wonderful startup mentor. And Linda, you had a few words to say as well, correct?
Yes, thank you. I will circulate a questionnaire to investigate the extent to which people would like to have a series of workshops that would run parallel with the ones that Ventures is already running, but that might be focused on the specific challenges facing women and people of color, because there are some specific challenges. So we'll see about the extent to which there is a need for that. And if there is, then we'll do it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the partnership to the advanced program and to Dr. Lenzer Steiner as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for your support.
Okay.
Thank you.